2 days after the best weekend you've had together, they start finding things wrong with you that never bothered them before. The way you laugh got too much. The way you texted good morning got too needy. The way you asked about their day got too intense. Nothing about you changed in 48 hours. What changed is how close you got. This has a name, and it's not that they finally saw the real you. It's called deactivating. A defense an avoidant nervous system runs the moment closeness starts to feel like too much. And one of its favorite tools isn't distance, isn't silence. It's criticism. Because if they can find something wrong with you, they don't have to sit with how much they actually feel. If this kind of clarity helps your nervous system settle, subscribe. PsychBond is a daily decoder for psychology, relationships, and avoidant and anxious attachment patterns, so you stop guessing. Deactivating strategies are one of the most well-documented defenses inside avoidant attachment, and devaluation is one of the sharpest versions of it. It works like this. Intimacy builds, warmth builds. The nervous system starts registering how much this person actually matters. And right as that registration peaks, the avoidant partner's mind starts producing reasons this isn't as good as it feels. You laugh too loud. You need too much. You're a little dramatic. You're not as put together as they thought. None of it is really about you. It's a manufactured exit ramp, built in real time, so the feeling of closeness has somewhere to go besides straight into their chest. Here's the part that makes it so disorienting. The criticism doesn't feel manufactured. It feels observed. It feels specific. It lands on something real, or close enough to real, that you start turning it over in your head at 2 a.m, wondering if they've finally seen something true about you that everyone else missed. That's exactly why it works as a defense. A vague complaint gets dismissed. A specific one gets absorbed. So the avoidant brain, without ever consciously deciding to do this, reaches for the detail that will actually stick. Why does this happen instead of just naming the discomfort out loud? Because for most people who lean avoidant, there was never a version of closeness that felt safe to name. Somewhere back in how they were raised, needing someone, or being needed, came with a cost. Too much responsibility handed to a kid too young to carry it, or emotional needs that were met with irritation instead of warmth, or a caregiver whose love arrived with strings that made independence the only reliable shelter. The lesson that got wired in wasn't closeness is dangerous. It was quieter and more specific than that. Closeness is fine right up until someone actually needs you back. And needing you back is exactly what falling for someone requires. This doesn't look identical in every avoidant person, and it's worth saying that plainly so this doesn't turn into a rigid label you apply to everyone who's ever criticized you. Some people run this pattern constantly in every relationship, regardless of how secure or steady their partner is. Others only run it under specific conditions: a particularly intense stretch of closeness, a milestone that raises the stakes, a moment that echoes something unresolved from an earlier relationship. The mechanism is the same underneath, but the frequency and intensity depend on how much capacity someone has built and how much life stress is already sitting on top of their system. Someone running on empty from work, family, or their own unrelated grief will have far less room to stay regulated when intimacy adds one more thing to metabolize. Which doesn't excuse the criticism, but does explain why the same person can handle closeness beautifully in one season and combust under it in another. So the nervous system builds a rule to protect that shelter. Let people in enough to get warmth, but not so far in that their needs become your responsibility. And when someone gets close enough to threaten that rule, the body doesn't experience it as excitement, even if the mind is telling a different story. It experiences it as exposure. Heart rate creeps up. There's a kind of static that starts under the surface. This isn't dramatic. It's not panic in the way anxious attachment panics. It's more like a low hum of alarm that says, "Get some air between you and this." And the fastest way to get air without physically leaving is to make the air feel earned. To make the space look like your fault instead of their retreat. If you could actually watch this happen in real time, it wouldn't look dramatic from the outside. It's not a fight response. It's smaller and slower than that. A subtle pulling back in the shoulders. A shift toward logistics and away from feelings. A sudden interest in the phone, the TV, the dishes, anything with a task attached to it. Internally, it often reads as irritability that doesn't have an obvious cause. They can't point to what's wrong, only that something feels wrong. And the mind, uncomfortable with an unnamed feeling, goes looking for something nameable to pin it on. You happen to be standing right there. This is the mechanism researchers actually describe when they talk about deactivating strategies. Suppressing attachment needs, minimizing the partner's importance, and, critically, inflating the partner's flaws to justify emotional distance that's really about the avoidant's own discomfort, not about anything the partner did. It's not a character flaw in the avoidant person. It's a strategy that worked once, a long time ago, and never got updated. It shows up differently depending on how far into the relationship you are, but the underlying move is always the same. Early on, it looks like sudden pickiness. The third date where they mention, almost casually, that you talk too much about your feelings, right after a first and second date that felt effortless. A year in, it looks like a running list that seems to grow every time the relationship deepens. You're too sensitive, too intense, too much to plan around, too quick to want reassurance. Notice that the list rarely shrinks and rarely gets specific enough to actually fix. That's not an accident. A fixable flaw would remove the exit ramp. A vague, expandable one keeps it open indefinitely. What does this actually create for the person on the receiving end? It creates a very specific, very effective kind of self-doubt. Not the loud kind, the quiet, corrosive kind that shows up as constant self-monitoring. You start pre-editing yourself before you even open your mouth. You start rehearsing texts to make sure they don't sound too eager. You start shrinking the parts of your personality that got flagged, hoping that if you take up less space, there will be nothing left to criticize. And here's the cruelest part of the loop. The more you shrink, the less alive you feel in the relationship. And the less alive you feel, the more you start believing their story about you instead of your own. This hits especially hard if you lean anxious yourself, because anxious attachment already comes with a built-in habit of scanning for what you might be doing wrong. You're already primed to look inward first when something feels off in a relationship. So when criticism shows up from someone you're falling for, it doesn't land on neutral ground. It lands on ground that's already been tilled for it. You don't just hear, "You've been a lot lately." You hear confirmation of a fear you've been carrying since long before this relationship started. That's not a coincidence, and it's not weakness. It's two nervous systems running two different old survival strategies at exactly the same moment. And one of them happens to be very good at manufacturing the evidence the other one is afraid of finding. Because that's what's actually happening underneath the criticism. Two competing stories are running at the same time. Their story says, "Something is wrong with you. That's why I need distance." Your story, if you're being honest with yourself, remembers exactly who you were before this relationship. Capable, warm, easy to be around, not particularly too much for anyone else in your life. The structure tells a different story than the criticism does. The structure is, nothing about you changed. Their capacity for closeness did. Believe the structure. Picture it side by side. The story, they said I'm too intense, so I must be too intense. The structure. This exact intensity didn't bother them a month ago, didn't bother the two people they dated before you, and doesn't bother the friends who've known you for years. What changed isn't your intensity. What changed is proximity. You got close enough that your intensity, which used to be background noise, is now something their nervous system has to actually metabolize in real time. The story blames the noise. The structure notices that the noise only became a problem once it moved next door. This is where most people get stuck, and it's worth naming directly, because it's the misread that keeps this pattern alive longer than it needs to survive. You start treating their criticism as data about you, when it's actually data about them. A flaw that only appears the week after you got closer isn't a flaw. It's a symptom. It's the nervous system's smoke alarm going off because intimacy tripped a wire that was installed decades before you ever met them. Mistaking a smoke alarm for an accurate description of the room is how good, self-aware people end up convinced they're the problem in a relationship where they were never actually the variable that changed. There's also a second misread that tends to travel with the first one, mistaking the sting of the criticism for proof of its accuracy. If it didn't hurt, you'd probably dismiss it. It hurts because you care what they think, and because some part of you is scared they might be right. But pain and accuracy are not the same thing. A comment can hurt and still be wrong. A comment can hurt precisely because it's aimed at something you're already insecure about, which makes it an efficient distancing tool, not an honest observation. Avoidant partners aren't usually doing this with malicious precision. They're not sitting there strategizing your weak points. But the nervous system is remarkably good at finding whatever will create the most space with the least effort. And your existing insecurities are the path of least resistance. The third misread is timing blindness, not tracking when the criticism shows up relative to what just happened between you. This is the single most useful thing you can start doing, because the pattern becomes almost impossible to miss once you look at it this way. Did the complaint arrive out of nowhere on an ordinary Tuesday? Or did it arrive 2 days after a weekend that felt closer than usual? Did it show up after you said something vulnerable? After a good conversation? After sex? After a moment where you let your guard down? If the criticism reliably follows closeness instead of following an actual pattern of behavior, that's not feedback. That's a nervous system trying to reestablish distance the only way it knows how, dressed up as an observation about you. So, what's actually missing here, structurally? It's not affection. Plenty of avoidant partners feel real affection, sometimes intense affection. And that's part of what makes this so confusing, because the warmth in between the criticism is genuine. What's missing is capacity. The capacity to stay present inside closeness without needing to create an exit. The capacity to feel exposed and not immediately look for a flaw to hide behind. The capacity to say, "I'm feeling overwhelmed by how close this is getting," instead of, "You've been a lot lately." One of those two very different sentences is a person taking real, active responsibility for their own nervous system. The other is a person outsourcing their discomfort onto the one person who didn't do anything except get close enough to matter. It helps to know what real feedback actually sounds like, because the two can get confused if you've spent long enough inside the deactivating version. Real feedback is specific, repeatable, and disconnected from timing. Someone says, "I need more notice before plans change," whether things are going well or going badly that week, and they say it the same way both times. Real feedback usually comes with some ownership attached, even a small amount. "This is something I struggle with too," or "I know this is partly my own stuff." Real feedback doesn't escalate the moment you get closer to them. If anything, it softens, because a person who's actually building capacity for intimacy wants closeness to feel safer over time, not more precarious. Deactivating criticism does the opposite on every count. It shows up unpredictably, tied to nothing but proximity. It carries zero ownership. The entire weight sits on you. And it tends to get sharper exactly when things are going well, because going well is the trigger, not the exception. This is also why "just don't take it personally" is such an incomplete answer. You can't logic your way out of a pattern you can't see clearly yet. What actually helps is building a filter, something concrete enough to use in the moment instead of a vague reminder to not overthink it. Here's one that works. Before you absorb a piece of criticism from someone you're close to, ask whether this is a pattern they've named consistently over time, regardless of how close you've recently gotten, or whether it's a detail that surfaced specifically after intimacy increased. Consistent, unrelated to closeness feedback deserves real consideration. That's actual information about how to be a better partner, and dismissing all criticism as deactivating would be its own mistake, one that closes you off from genuinely useful input just as effectively as absorbing all of it closes you off from your own sense of self. Feedback that clusters right after vulnerability deserves a different response. Not defensiveness, not immediate compliance, just recognition. Recognition that what you're looking at is a nervous system protecting itself, not a verdict on your character. It's worth knowing what the opposite of this looks like, because it's the thing that actually tells you whether someone has the capacity to grow past this pattern. Real accountability doesn't sound like a longer, more detailed list of your flaws. It sounds smaller and more uncomfortable for them to say out loud. Something closer to, "I noticed I got critical right after we had that really good night, and I don't think that's about you." That sentence costs them something. It requires looking at their own defense instead of aiming it outward. Criticism is easy to produce and expensive to hear. Ownership is expensive to produce and, over time, is what actually makes closeness feel safe instead of like a countdown to the next complaint. If you've never once heard anything close to that sentence, that's information too. Not a life sentence on the relationship, but a clear answer to whether the pattern is being worked on or simply being repeated. Something else worth naming clearly. This pattern doesn't mean the relationship is doomed, and it doesn't mean the avoidant person doesn't care. Caring and capacity are two separate things, and conflating them is how people stay in a loop of trying to earn their way out of criticism that was never really about earning anything. Someone can care about you deeply and still lack the internal architecture to stay steady when that caring gets tested by real closeness. The caring is often real. The architecture is what's missing. And architecture, unlike affection, can actually be built. But only if the person doing the criticizing is willing to notice what they're doing instead of outsourcing the discomfort onto you indefinitely. For you, the person on the receiving end, the work isn't to become smaller, quieter, or easier to criticize into silence. It's to get better and faster at telling the difference between real feedback and a defense wearing feedback's clothes. It's to notice the timing. It's to stop rehearsing yourself into a version that's designed to be uncriticizable, because that version doesn't exist. A nervous system looking for an exit will always find something, and shrinking yourself just gives it smaller and smaller things to use. This is the trap so many people fall into without realizing it, trying to fix your way out of a moving target. You soften your tone because you got called intense, then get called distant. You give more space because you got called needy, then get called checked out. Each adjustment gets met with a new complaint, because the complaints were never really cataloging your behavior in the first place. They were tracking their own comfort level, which shifts independently of anything you do. You cannot out-adjust a system that isn't actually responding to your adjustments. The only thing that changes the pattern is the avoidant partner building their own capacity to stay present. And that's not a project you can complete on their behalf, no matter how precisely you edit yourself. None of this means the person doing the criticizing is a lost cause, and it doesn't mean one instance of this erases whatever real growth they've done elsewhere. People can be actively working on themselves in most areas of their life and still slip into an old defense the moment intimacy gets close enough to trip it. Growth is rarely a straight line, and a single relapse into criticism after closeness isn't proof that nothing has changed. What matters isn't whether it happens once. It's whether it gets named, owned, and worked on when it does, or whether it gets repeated and defended every single time closeness shows back up. It's also worth saying plainly, you're allowed to name what you're noticing. Not as an accusation, not as a way to catch them in the act, but as a simple, calm observation. Something like, I've noticed the criticism tends to show up right after we've been close. I want to understand what's actually going on for you in those moments. That single sentence does two things at once. It gives them a chance to get honest about their own discomfort instead of routing it through you, and it gives you real information about whether they're capable of that honesty right now, or whether they're going to double down on the criticism instead. Either answer tells you something true. It's worth saying what this costs you if it goes unaddressed for long enough, because the pattern rarely stays contained to the relationship it started in. Months of absorbing criticism that was never really about you starts to rewrite how you see yourself outside of them, too. People who came into a relationship secure in who they were start describing themselves a year later as too much, as if it's simply a fact about them rather than a story one specific nervous system needed to tell in order to feel safe. That's the real damage. Not the individual comments, but the slow erosion of an accurate self-concept, replaced by whatever kept the peace with someone who couldn't yet tolerate real closeness. Getting the timing-based filter in place early isn't just about protecting the relationship. It's about protecting your own read on yourself before it quietly gets overridden. And if the answer is doubling down, if every attempt to name the pattern gets met with more evidence about what's wrong with you instead of any ownership of what's happening in them, that's not proof you're too sensitive. That's proof of exactly how much capacity currently exists in this relationship for closeness to be met with anything other than distance dressed up as truth. The reset here isn't complicated, even though the pattern feels complicated while you're inside it. When a piece of criticism lands, before you let it rewrite how you see yourself, ask 3 things. What actually changed right before this showed up? Whether this has been named consistently over time or only after closeness. and whether you'd believe this same criticism if a calm, secure person who loved you steadily had said it, or whether it only carries weight because of who said it and how much it would cost you to lose them. That last question does more work than almost anything else, because it separates the content of the criticism from the fear underneath it. The fear of losing someone, which is a completely different thing from the truth of what they said. Run it against last week if you want to test whether the filter actually works. Think of the last piece of criticism that stuck with you. What had just happened right before it? An ordinary day, or a moment where you'd let them in a little further than usual? Has this exact thing been named before, calmly, outside of a moment like that one? Or did it only ever surface right after closeness? And if your steadiest, most secure friend had said the same sentence to you on an ordinary Tuesday with nothing at stake, would it have carried the same weight? Or would you have shrugged it off in a sentence? If the weight only exists because of who said it and what losing them would mean, you're not looking at truth. You're looking at leverage that fear handed to the wrong argument. Write those 3 questions down if you have to. Keep them somewhere you can actually reach in the moment. Because in the moment, right after the sting lands, is exactly when you're least equipped to think clearly. And exactly when the old habit of turning inward and rewriting yourself is strongest. A filter you can only remember later, once the damage to how you see yourself is already done, isn't much of a filter at all. You are not the flaw they found. You are the closeness that made them need to find one. That distinction is the whole difference between spending months, sometimes years, trying to fix something that was never broken in the first place, and finally, clearly understanding what you were actually looking at the entire time. If this helped your body feel a little safer, liking this video helps it reach someone else who needs this clarity. Welcome to PsychBond. You're safe here.